Chapter 2. Uncle Charles smoked such black twist that at last his nephew suggested to him to enjoy his morning smoke in a little outhouse at the end of the garden. Very good, Simon. All serene, Simon, said the old man tranquilly. Anywhere you like. The outhouse will do me nicely. It will be more salubrious. Damn me, said Mr. Douglas frankly, if I know how you can smoke such a villainous awful tobacco. It's like a gunpowder, by God. It's very nice, Simon, replied the old man. Very cool. Every morning, therefore, Uncle Charles repaired to his outhouse, but not before he had creased and brushed his back hair and brushed and put on his tall hat. While he smoked, the brim of his tall hat and a bowl of his pipe were just visible beyond the jambs of the outhouse door. His arbour, as he called the reeking outhouse, which he shared with the cat and the garden tools, served him also as a sounding box, and every morning they hummed contentedly one of his favourite songs. Oh, twine me a bower, or a blue eyes and a golden hair, or the growth of the blarney, while the grey and blue coils of smoke rose slowly from his pipe and vanished in the pure air. During the first part of the summer in the Black Rock, Uncle Charles was Stephen's constant companion. Uncle Charles was a hale old man with a well-tanned skin, watch features, and white side whiskers. One weekdays he did message between the house in a Crisford Avenue and those shops in a main street of the town which the family dealt. Stephen was glad to go with him on these errands, for Uncle Charles helped him very liberally to handfuls of whatever was exposed in open boxes and barrels outside the counter. He would seize a handful of grapes and sawdust or 3 or 4 American apples and thrust them generously into his grandnephew's hand while the shopman smiled uneasily. And on Stephen's fidgeting reluctance to take them, he would frown and say, "Take them, sir. Do you hear me, sir? They are good for your bowels." When the orderlies had been booked, the two would go on to the park, where an old friend of Stephen's father, Mike Flynn, would be found seated on a bench waiting for them. Then would begin Stephen's run around the park. Mike Flynn would stand at the gate near the railway station. Mike Flynn favored, his head high lifted, his knees were lifted, and his hands held straight down by his side. When the morning practice was over, the trainer would make his comments and sometimes illustrate them by shuffling along for a yard or so comically in an old pair of the blue canvas shoes. A small ring of the wonder-struck children and the nursemaids would gather to watch him and linger even when he and Uncle Charles had sat down again and were talking athletics and politics. Thought he had heard his father say that Mike Flynn had put some of the best runners of the modern times through his hands. Stephen often glanced at his father-trainer's flabby, stubble-covered face as it bent over the long, stained fingers through which he rolled his cigarettes, and with a pity at the mild, lustrous blue eyes which would look up suddenly from the task and gaze vaguely into the blue distance while the long, swollen fingers ceased their rolling, and grains and fibers of tobacco fell back into the pouch. On the way home, Uncle Charles would often pay a visit to the chapel, and as the font was above Stephen's reach, the old man would dip his hand and then sprinkle the water briskly about Stephen's clothes. And on the floor of the porch, while he prayed, he knelt on his red handkerchief and read above his breath from a thumb blackened prayer book wherein catchwords were printed at the foot of every page. Stephen knelt at his side, respecting. Tough he did not share. His pity, he often wondered what his granddad prayed for so seriously. Perhaps he prayed for the soul in purgatory or for the grace of the happy death, or perhaps he prayed that God might send him back a part of the big fortune he had squandered in a cork. On a Sunday, Stephen with his father and his grand-uncle took their constitutional. The old man was a nimble walker in spite of his corns, and often 10 or 12 miles of the road were covered. The little village of the steel ground was the parting of the ways. Either they went to the left towards the Dublin mansion or along the Ghostown road and thence into the Dundrum. Coming home by Sandy Ford, trotting along the road, or standing in some grimy wayside public house, his elders spoke constantly of the subjects nearer their hearts, of the Irish politics, of a monster, and the legends of their own family, to all of which Stephen lent an awed ear. Words which he did not understand, he said over and over to him. Self-till he had learned them by heart, and through them he had glimpses of the real world about him. The hour when he too would take a part in the life of that world seemed drawing near, and in secret he began to make ready for the great part which he felt awaited him, the nature of which he only dimly apprehended. His evenings were his own, and he pored over a rich translation of the Count of Monte Cristo. The figure of the dark Avengers stood forth in his mind for whatever he had heard or divined in childhood of the strange and the terrible. At night he built up on a parlour table an image of the wonderful island carved out of a transfers and paper flowers and coloured tissue paper and strips of the silver and a golden paper in which chocolate is strips of the wrapped when he had broken up the secondary, weary of its tinsel. There would come to his mind the bright picture of a Marcellus, of sunny trellis, of the Mercedes. Outside the black rock, on the road that led to the mountain, stood a small whitewashed house in a garden of which grew many rose bushes. And in this house he told himself another Mercedes lived. Both on an outward and on a homeward journey he measured distance by this landmark. And in his imagination he lived through a long train of the adventures, marvelous as those in the book itself. This video is taken for Navidaria's page.